Okay, why don't we get going? We're going to have about 40 minutes or so. I'm going to cut it a little bit short so folks can make the next keynote session that's following. But this session is being recorded, so folks that are participating live, if you can't stay for all of the session, we will be posting via the conference the links to the videos after the fact. And for everybody who is joining via video, welcome. My name is Scott Foote. I have been in this space for about 35 years or so. This space being cybersecurity and security operations in general. About half of my career has been as a vendor. The other half has been as a consumer, as an analyst, as a CISO most recently, but a user and implementer of the technologies, as well as the people and processes in place to take advantage of that. What we're covering in this session is what I call a taxonomy of a security operations center. And essentially what it's going to be is a compendium of 20 short stories for you. We're going to move quickly given we're constrained with time. But I'd like to touch the wave tops of all the different aspects of a security operations center. It's come up over and over again in my career. And at one point, I was doing a keynote session for some folks on Wall Street, and one of the big complaints they had was that they had too many tools in their security operations center. So I said, okay, let's stop the conversation. Let's talk about why you have all these tools. Let's talk about what the SOC does functionally. This taxonomy is a result of that. So we're going to go through that in some depth. But before I do that, let me talk about why are we here at this conference? Why talk about security operations? I understand that Dr. Woody did an excellent job on her session this morning, talking more in depth about security engineering and the broader challenge we have of connecting what's going on in the infrastructure up to the business or the missions that are being impacted. That's going to be a touch of what I talk about. But security operations is about making that connection and applying that connection to all three aspects of our conference, the systemics. Of course, in order to do this well, security operations, we need to study and model the business. We need to understand those dependencies. That's going to be a theme you'll see throughout my 20 stories. Secondarily, we need to understand system theory. It isn't about defending a device. It's about understanding what role that device plays in the larger system. And I mean system as in people, processes, and technologies, not just the technology. Cybernetics is inherently about, of course, regulatory systems. That's what we do with cybersecurity. We regulate the business. We don't regulate the technology. We regulate the business by taking control of the information flow through the business. We continuously evolve our regulatory system through feedback. We have to because the environment's evolving. We're not defending against a static adversary, we're defending against conflict. And ultimately, as Dr. Woody had said this morning, if we don't understand those relationships, those causal chains, we can't effectively defend, but we can effectively make decisions on what needs to be defended and what our actions as defenders might have, negative or positive, in terms of impacting the business. And the last piece, of course, is informatics. Security operations is all about computational systems. They themselves transform information, but it is about defending the business to prevent those that would exploit our dependency on information. It comes down to that information flow. So I think it's a good fit. I've been here 4 or 5 years ago. I did one of the keynotes. This is going to be a different session, but we're going to touch on some of those themes from before. So as I said when we got started, why a SOC taxonomy? I hear repeatedly in my business as a virtual CISO, where do I start building a SOC? Do I even need to build a SOC, or should I outsource it? From the mature environments I've been in, many banks in particular on Wall Street, I hear the concern, why do I have so many tools? That in fact was what gave birth to this presentation, to this taxonomy, and what we're going to cover here, trying to rationalize all of that. The response most folks have is to try and just inventory things. I said, let's do a capability reference model. Let's understand the dozen or 2 dozen capabilities that are critical to a security ops center. We'll group them by the 7 major challenges. Not every security ops center is going to deal with all the challenges or all the capabilities. Let's pull them all together so we can begin to understand what a mature full-scale SOC looks like for a global enterprise. The people I've intended this presentation for are those who need to educate senior leadership on what it is we do in security operations, first and foremost. Many people think we just sit watching screens like what I have on behind me, and we look for the red dot that beeps and says, hey, Scott, we've got a security violation, you need to take an action. Security ops centers are considerably more than that, as we're going to get into. Hopefully this taxonomy presents a foundation for planning your investments, for looking at where you need to make your investments, whether they're on-premise or whether they're outside with a hosted service provider, to be able to drive those investments by priority and risk and what's going to have the biggest return to your business. And lastly, for functional requirements, I get asked all the time to evaluate technologies in security ops centers. I have been a vendor. I even have patents on some of these technologies from 20 years ago. Start with understanding the requirements first. That gives us a better foundation to compare and contrast these solutions. So let's dive into the SOC taxonomy of sorts. This is a picture that if I could, I would print you all out posters and hang it on your wall, because I regularly refer to the capabilities and the technologies that support them using this map. The 7 basic challenge areas across left to right. Knowing yourself, we're going to dive into each one of these in depth. Knowing yourself is important. We rarely spend enough time doing this. We assume we know everything about our business and its dependencies, and in fact, in most cases, in my experience, we don't. Knowing your adversaries has become very much in vogue lately. That is a good thing. We're going to dissect that a little bit. Managing access controls is something that's often overlooked for security ops centers. But we in the Security Ops Center, we need to provision identities and the credentials that go along with that to support authentication. We need to deal with the authorization and privilege model, both the granting and the revocation of those privileges. And we deal with the access and privacy in terms of actually enforcing that in the environment. We'll talk about monitoring detection. This is what most people think a SOC is, purely monitoring and detection. It is an important part, but by no means is that the only thing that we focus on. Responding, yes, everyone has to respond. We all have incidents. Hopefully, they're not severe. But it's becoming more and more commonplace, and companies and organizations are more willing to share what they do in terms of their response. Investigating that activity, again, we might do on-prem, we might do it with a service provider, but it's critical to recognize security ops is in charge of it, whoever performs it. And lastly comes the visibility and reporting. This is mostly for leadership. We'll talk in monitoring detection about visibility to the analyst, how we present information to the analyst. This visibility and reporting on the far right is all about leadership. But the last thing I want to draw your attention to in the bottom of this slide is that dark blue box that I would refer to as scope. Scope is a huge problem for the Security Ops Center. There is so much implied with leadership, what they think security operations might have a handle on. Yes, with the data, yes, with the networks. Hopefully most of our services on-prem or hosted. The endpoints themselves, which are proliferating, as we know, right? Mobile, tablet, you name it, even virtual devices, virtual desktops. The users themselves are in scope. We have to have an understanding of their behavior. Cloud services and shadow IT, we're going to talk about that to some depth. And now today we're talking about operational technology, factory floors and pharmaceutical environments that manufacture chemicals we rely on for health. Industrial control systems as the broader category, or cyber physical as people have come to call them more recently. And lastly, this plethora of IoT, which I loosely describe as the insect world in the IT space, because they're digging and burrowing into all of our organizations on our networks, and they bring with them threat. We'll get into all of that scope, but that scope is continuously creeping, and it's a big challenge for security operations. So without further ado, let's start carving into the 7 challenges. The first one being know yourself in the Sun Tzu theory or philosophy of conflict. And by the way, that's what we're talking about, is managing conflict. First and foremost, asset and configuration management. You can't defend what you don't know you have. Most of us respond to that with an asset and configuration management capability, ACM or CMS. The first thing we do in that space is typically vulnerability assessments, and we try to drive down vulnerabilities. The problems here: first, asset and configuration management is not the responsibility of security ops, but we cannot do our job well if the organization hasn't made the investment. We've got to work in cooperation with the IT organization to do that. The second is this scope creep. The idea that these devices are proliferating, that's not visible to leadership, but it's compounding the requirements in terms of time, money, and capabilities, what needs to be invested in defending the network. That scope creep is a big problem. Without disciplined asset and configuration management that covers the whole spectrum, we're going to have a lot of that shadow IT. And the last point here is that in this particular category, we focus a lot on configurations or the vulnerabilities of those configurations. Yes, it's basic hygiene. Yes, we need to do it. Yes, most of the exploitation today happens because people have not patched systems, but it's not a panacea, and it's not a useful perspective on risk of the business. Takeaway from this slide, in the Security Ops Center, define the scope. What is in or out of bounds with regards to what we're doing in the Security Ops Center? Now let's talk about the shadows. How do we expose them? I call this shadow breaking. I do this from an offensive perspective with clients that don't understand why they need to do it. We show them what the adversary can find out, where we ourselves on the defensive side maybe don't have the deliberate discipline to go and continuously discover. We've got to get our arms around that cyber entropy of all these shadow IT components and services and all the doorways in and out to the greater public domain. The typical response here where asset discovery are things like wireless site surveys, network scanning, Nmap Nessus, they're all your friends. Wireshark is a big one I've used. The point is, we need to continually stay on top of it, and it's not just on IP, TCP/IP networks. It's on all of the interconnected devices we've got in our environment. A couple of serious caveats here. This is also not the responsibility of security operations. Sometimes it falls within our domain. More often it falls within the IT domain. Could be we're fully embedded into the IT department, but we've got to do this continuous discovery. Or there's this ever-expanding attack surface we can't get our arms around. Something that comes up for me personally, my commercial side, is what did we buy when we bought a company or organization? What were the IT assets? What came on board? Who is the custodian of those assets? Because we need to maintain the discipline. In many cases, we need to raise the level of discipline in defending and protecting those assets. Point there, don't get sloppy. Takeaway here, no shadows. I talked about the service that we've been doing for a long time in my business of shadow breaking and exposing not just the fact that these exist in our environment, services as well as devices, but our dependencies on those. And that takes us to the third space here, capability area 3, business dependency mapping. I will confess to you, I've never met anyone that does this well. This is the #1 problem with a security ops center. They have no context within which to interpret the events and the incidents that are coming across all of their sensor infrastructure. The typical response here is to actually engage in some type of business dependency mapping. That's a variety of things we can do, from enterprise architecture all the way through to business impact analysis. But no one does it well. No one wants to do it. It's a considered bookkeeping rather than a strategic investment. I can tell you the time to do this is not after the fact, after the lights have been shut out by the adversary. The time to do this is before, to inform your strategy on how you're going to defend the environment. It will also smooth out the majority of what's going on in the Security Ops Center, because security ops will understand what's important, what's critical to the business. Not what's important because somebody declared it to be anecdotally, but because there are critical business dependencies. We need to figure out what those dependencies are. We cannot rely on software alone to discover and describe those dependencies. I'll get into that another time, but the point is, this is not something that can be purely observed by software. Humans need to be involved. If you don't have the discipline to do a full business impact analysis, do what is an abbreviated version. I call it DARE. DARE is an acronym. Obviously, it stands for data. What are your business functions and what is the data they depend upon? A is for applications that manage that data. I is the infrastructure, whether I own it or it's hosted, where is that infrastructure? And R is, what is the risk? Let's do an inventory of the risk, starting with vulnerabilities, but understanding how those cascade into consequences. Let's put together a DARE matrix. Larger organizations will have enterprise architecture somewhere. Yes, it's typically the to-be, not the as-is, but far better to start with that because it's an authoritative data source. Start with it and evolve it, but don't ignore it. Dependencies are fundamental to doing the job and providing effective defense of the organization. Challenge 2 is about knowing your adversary now. Let's go look at cyber threat intelligence. This has been going for about 10, maybe 15 years now as a space where we have vendors doing it. We've always been able to do this with open source for those of us that have been in the space and known how to. Now we've got vendors across the board that do this, and they sell these feeds as a way of selling something more than what was signature-based before. So what are the challenges? The adversaries are continuously evolving. There's no such thing as signature-based defense anymore. That is barely the kindergarten of cyber defense these days. You really need to understand who the adversaries are, what are their objectives, how are their capabilities evolving, and how might I observe them, not just through the capability in a digital artifact, but the behavior that they display on my infrastructure, and maybe even behavior before they get in. Typical responses here, yes, cyber threat intelligence platforms or TIPs, TIP, that help us to pull that information in, but we need to apply that knowledge. We apply it through models like the Lockheed Martin, they put together something called the kill chain, the cyber kill chain, where we can look up and down the adversary's own business process model and say, what can we observe about their behavior along this entire spectrum? What are the indicators, and we'll talk about that in a second, that we need to be watching for, inside or outside our perimeter, that help expose that? There's been a series of standards that have emerged. Of course, the ISACs. Hopefully, most of you participate in the ISACs for your vertical industry. This is where we share this threat intelligence. A couple of the caveats here. This is not purely an extension of the signature-based defense. There's quite a bit more involved here. This is far more of an intelligence function than it is pure information. The attackers are always going to be ahead of the defenders. They have time on their side. They have resources. They continuously evolve. We are always playing catch-up. And because of that, it's far more of an art than a science in terms of being able to capture this threat intelligence and make it actionable. The takeaway here, the 3 different levels of indicators. First is the indicators of attack. Hopefully you're seeing this through your partners in industry and the rest of the vertical space. In indicators of behavior, MITRE's ATT&CK is a fantastic knowledge base that's it has evolved over the past 2 decades, really, to describe behaviors both outside before the attack as well as after the compromise inside on your network. And then, of course, we have cyber threat intelligence, the traditional IOCs, or indicators of compromise. This needs to be a comprehensive set of intelligence, and there needs to be someone who does this as a full-time job. This isn't something that can just be done by a couple of people on a part-time basis. Let's get now into the actual controls themselves. Security operations, we manage identities. The identities are not just for person entities, but they're also non-person entities like devices, files, processes, software, you name it. We have to provision those identities and deal with the identity for a long period of time. The response, of course, is IDAM. We've been in this space for a while. We've used a lot of different IDAM capabilities. They're good. Over the internet, what are we doing in terms of identity? We're declaring things that here is the identity of a piece of software. It's signed with a digital cert. Digital signatures on the exchanges that we make. This is good infrastructure, but it needs to be managed by security ops. We have to understand those identities are targets. They're the #1 targets for data breaches. We need to have systems that allow us to provision or register those identities. Self-registration, centralized, it's complex. Not all the solutions that we can get for IDAM are good for managing the entire spectrum of identities. Important takeaway for this story is the identity is the root of trust. Without disciplined identity management, there is no trust. Let's dive into authentication. Where we are here, proving the identity of either the person or the non-person entity. The response, of course, is credentials. Multi-factor, ideally. It's something we know, something we have, something we are, and more recently, something we do. That's my addition to the list. But it's important to acknowledge we should be managing multiple factors to authenticate these identities. It should also be important to acknowledge that things that we know, things that we are, and even things that we do begin to fall under PII, personally identifiable information that is now regulated by law. So credentials are the secondary top target. Once we have the identity, we want the credentials for that person. There's no single authentication mechanism that's foolproof. I'm not educating anyone on that fact. Use more than one. But more than one requires management and performance overhead. This is a place where PII comes up on a regular basis. Many people I speak to, I say, what are you dealing with for personally identifiable information? They say, oh, we're not doing anything like that. We don't have commercial end users. I said, wait a minute. What about the identities and credentials of all the people that you have that are internal users or partners or vendors? All of that is conceivably PII given the international laws. Now we get into authorization. This is where we're granting access. Two different modes, MAC and DAC, right? Mandatory access control approach or discretionary access. Both of them are applied for person and non-person entities. Let's just talk about discretionary since that's predominant in business. Those access controls, typically we talk about things like group-based, role-based, more common today, attribute-based. This is fundamentally important, but it's also complex. The more granular we build these perimeters where we provide these checks, the more complexity and the more of a management overhead it puts on the guys in the security ops center. Everything from both granting the access, but also checking things like the CRLs to make sure that credentials haven't been revoked. This requires not just the discipline in the process, but underlying technologies. The takeaway here are that these principles of least privilege and zero trust, they are making this more complex. I fully support these principles, but I recognize that security operations bears the burden of managing the additional complexity we're introducing into the environment. Now let's talk about access and privacy in general. Well, the challenge, of course, is we need confidentiality, whether it's for a person and their privacy or whether it's for intellectual property. We need it when information is moving in transit, also at rest, but sometimes in use as well. Typically, we're using cryptography to do that. Well, that means we need to manage it. We've got to manage. Key management is a significant challenge here to security ops centers. Just in managing them and retiring them and re-provisioning credentials. Key management is it's non-trivial. As we move beyond that into things like DLP, now we're asking the organization to label all the data elements they've got, even if they're not encrypted. And we need to provide some data segmentation for things that are, for example, privacy-based information, more complexity introduced into the environment. I strongly advise folks before they dive into this to do a privacy impact analysis or a PIA, or privacy impact assessment to some folks, and look at techniques for minimizing the privacy information as much as possible. Complexity is not our friend in the security ops center. We're challenged with it all the time. And with data loss prevention, if you're not labeling and segmenting your data, you can basically kiss your data goodbye. Any DLP solution is going to rely upon you having the discipline in your organization to track that data. There are techniques out there for doing automatic discovery, but it's not ubiquitous and it's not perfect at this point. All right, now into the core of monitoring and detection, which is what most of us think we do. That's what the security ops folks have with the big data walls, if you've ever been in one of these ops centers. There's an architectural concept that's been promoted by John Authz of ESG. He's an analyst. He calls it SOPA, Security Operations and Analytics Platform Architecture. That's essentially what we're talking about on the left-hand side here. Let's start with instrumentation. You've got to instrument your environment. That means things like taps and spans on your network structure. It means agents running maybe locally on a platform or something that's remote. It means dropping things into your environment that might break crypto so you can see what's going out on encrypted HTTP pipes at your perimeter to fully understand what's there. Instrumentation alone produces 50, 60, 70 different vendors that we've got to work with depending upon how deep we're trying to instrument the environment. It brings with it overhead. We've got to continuously tune them, and that's the bumper sticker here. There is no set and forget with instruments. With all of these sensors, there is the chance for them to be exploited and for them to disinform us and disinform things like the machine learning algorithms that we think are going to replace some of our analysts. There is no replacement for a lack of sufficient instrumentation. If you don't have eyes on, like in the cloud, you're not going to see things when they happen. It's got to be there. Now, once we've instrumented, we need to bring all that data together. We've got to aggregate it, filter it, fuse it. We've got to do the correlation, do the combination We'll talk about the detection analytics in a minute. We also need the ability to drill in and out of this information. This is what most people call the big data problem. We started with things like vulnerability management, dumping everything into databases. We've moved on to SIMs, for example, with SNMP years and years ago, 25 years ago now. More recently, SCAP, Security Control Automation Protocol, has tried to create some standards. We've got a whole bunch of standards for moving larger things like net flows, superflows, and PCAP back for analysts to dissect it, take it apart. This idea that we can collect everything continuously just doesn't scale, right? It's absurd. And worse, we're dumping all this data onto analysts that don't have any context, so they don't have any idea how to sort it out. Number one problem here is analyst burnout and turnover. We dump this data on top of them. More data is not better. It's actually worse. And in every environment I've seen to date, people are doing this in band. They're doing it on the actual production networks. They're not doing it on an out-of-band network that can be defended, protected, and frankly provisioned in terms of bandwidth, specifically for the management traffic. People are dumping this on the backbone of their company. Two takeaways here. I am not a fan of big data. I worked for Oracle back in the early 90s. We never had anything but big data. I'm a fan of quality versus quantity. Know what you need to collect, focus on that, bring it in, and then plan for retention. Not because you need to do it first and foremost legally, we do have some obligations there, but because our heuristics are based on this data. What we know about the environment, most importantly, what we know about good is derived from this data. Not what we know about bad, that's a fantasy. It's far better to dig into this data, to build heuristics that help us to address good, to characterize good with our AI algorithms. Then what's left over is suspicious and worthy of attention. That's where we get into detection. We're trying to detect these incidents. We're doing it manually. We're doing it automated. We're driving it off from all of the indicators I talked about earlier. Big data is not the panacea that people have hoped it would be. It is good for things like user and entity behavior analytics based upon the heuristics I just talked about. Machine learning algorithms are very useful here. Whether you're talking about supervised or unsupervised learning, we're getting better in this space. But there's still a lot of snake oil in terms of what the promises are here of machine learning. You have to train these algorithms the same as you would train the human analyst. You need to train the machines that are doing this. And we're all fallible, human or not, we're fallible. Garbage in is garbage out. We have to understand that we will build biases into our machine learning algorithms over time if we aren't careful about educating them on both what is good as well as what is bad activity on our networks. It is an intelligence problem first and foremost. I like the term artificial intelligence because it's not saying it's just an information or data problem. This is an intelligence problem where we don't have perfect information and the adversary is constantly manipulating. Up here in visualization, everybody likes to see the dashboards and the displays. We talk about what we're using them for. Let's just put a bunch of data up on the wall. Data is useless. Visualizations like this are useless if they don't answer questions, and I'm going to get into the 5 what imperatives here in a minute as we step to the next slide. But this idea of a single pane of glass or a dashboard or a cup. I actually am on advisory boards for a handful of technology companies trying to break into the market. And they're trying to build things like a single pane of glass. And my first response to them is to answer what question? We're not putting data on the wall for the sake of decorating the wall. We're trying to answer questions. We'll cover that. Caveats here are complexity is not your friend. It overwhelms your users. If they don't have context within which to understand the data that you're putting on the wall, it's just going to be misleading. It's going to take them down a path that's unproductive. We need to focus on that business dependency mapping in order to inform what it is we're providing these analysts. The 5 what imperatives. Please, if you take nothing else away from this briefing, these 5 are important. What? What is happening? What do I need to pay attention to? The second, so what? When I have an event, can I put it in terms of the business? Who cares? So what? Third, what else? No adversary is doing things one at a time. There is no event you will ever see that is happening in isolation. What else? Back to the intelligence picture, can I put together the picture of the adversary and what they're trying to do? Now what? What am I going to do about it? What are my options? And then what if? What if I decided to take the option of unplugging the network? What's that going to do, not to the adversary first and foremost, but to my business? Am I going to cause a lights out situation because I take the big hammer to the adversary? Cyber SA in general, I put this model together about 10 years ago for, it happens to have been the US military, but we talked about it and I said there are 3 categories of intelligence we need. The first is the network. The second is the mission that depends on those networks, and in commercial space, that's business. The third is the threat that is trying to exploit those networks to produce an effect on the business. That is the intelligence we need the Security Ops Center to have. It is non-trivial. Let's keep going with informed incident response. SOAR is a term you've probably all heard in this space. It is actually not an architecture, it's a product category, even though it gets compared with SOPA often. SOAR stands for Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response. Buyer beware, this is useful. I do own stock in some of these companies, but we can't automate everything. First and foremost, we need to be able to do consequence analysis. So way back in the 90s, I created this risk formula to drive people to looking at the consequence piece. If there is no consequence, it doesn't matter what the threat is exploiting the vulnerability, we have no risk. That's the reason why it's a multiplicative formula. But of course, in our world, we do have consequence. We need to understand those consequences, not just to say, so what about what's happening with the adversary, but so what if I play a particular countermeasure, what's that going to do to my business? We need to make these decisions based not on anecdotal understanding of the system and the business, but on clear understandings of those mission critical dependencies, which Dr. Woody referred to earlier today. We have to leverage this business dependency mapping I keep going on and on about. Again, if you can't afford a full business impact analysis, if you don't have enterprise architecture, focus on building a DARE matrix. It's straightforward, it is accomplishable, and it will be an eye-opener for most people in terms of exposing those shadows. Now let's talk about incident response. No surprises here. We've got to have a disciplined response. We need a ticketing capability. More importantly, we need the workflow and the process that will take advantage of that. What's missing is the ability to prioritize based on consequences. Solutions like Remedy, VMC Remedy is a wonderful capability, but it does not allow us to prioritize based upon impact to the business. It doesn't give us an inventory of relevant countermeasures, and it's certainly not where we're actually parking our digital forensics. We need to pre-plan these workflows. They should be scenario-driven, and they should be tested. We should be documenting all of this in an incident response plan. And in fact, most of the businesses I work with, their customers are now demanding to see the evidence they have a formalized incident response plan. Note that the execution of these plans should always be considered privileged and confidential and include the attorney. That should be protecting what it is that you're doing in terms of your response to a problem, because they will be inspected later when you wind up in some type of a legal situation. Now let's talk about those countermeasures. We've got to build those countermeasures. We need to understand what are the TTPs that we're trying to mitigate, how do we build countermeasures, and how do we assess those countermeasures in terms of their usefulness. They need to be tracked in terms of their objectives, cost effectiveness, you name it. We have to have these commodity response actions in place in order to, whether we automate the response or we have the humans manually implementing these responses, we need to have these pre-approved. They can't be something we're deciding on the fly, because they may have a specific business impact. Somebody needs to make the decision. Some of these might be preemptive in terms of deception and active defense. All of these require some level of pre-approval. That's going to be fundamental to vet them and get them in place so we can bring the more junior analysts on and allow them, maybe it's an automated environment, allow them to respond. Here is where we take the action. We don't always have the authority in security ops to take the action. We aren't always the people who do it. Often it's the IT department. It may even be a vendor. And we do need to have some ability to remotely control these environments. That in itself is a vulnerability. We've talked a lot about commodity responses here, because in this space of security automation, if it's a commodity problem, we can automate the commodity response. We do not want to be trying to automate a set of commodity responses when we're being played by a sophisticated adversary, because our decisions demand trade-offs. How much are we willing to take an impact on the business in order to achieve the minimization of the adversary's effects on the business? This point is an important one. Do not trust computers to improvise. That's not what they do. Humans improvise, computers follow instructions. In the previous capability, we built them those plays and instructions. Here we're going to implement them as appropriate, but don't rely on them to improvise against a sophisticated adversary. Now let's talk quickly about digital forensics. Most people overlook this completely until they've been owned. Here, we have to have the ability to do some level of sophisticated analytics, but it should be done by staff that are certified in this space. This was a hobby shop when I started doing this in 1988 as an offshoot of my job as an internals engineer for an operating system. This is now a professional discipline, and I would encourage everybody, if you haven't got people on staff that are certified, work with an external organization that specializes in this, because there is discipline to the processes and what we do, not just the capabilities and the tools. It does rely on our existing instrumentation, because without that instrumentation, we're not getting the evidential artifacts. First and foremost, as a takeaway, isolate and image whatever you feel has been compromised. Secondarily, you want to analyze the copies. You do not want to analyze the original artifacts because they won't be admissible. And it is, again, very much an art versus a science, because you're working against sophisticated adversaries who know what they're doing and understand how to hide themselves. Now let's talk about managing cases. This is not workflow of incident response. This is after the fact. How do I coordinate a broad team of multidisciplinary people when we're doing some level of strategic analysis? Whatever we do needs to be legally defensible, because if we bring this to court later in a criminal or even a civil action, we need to be able to defend the practices. A formal case management system is critical to being able to track and describe this, because after the fact, we need to be able to tell a story to ourselves as lessons learned in the postmortem, to our leadership team so they understand what has actually happened and where the liabilities are, and to any external legal engagement we get involved with so they understand what we have done in terms of due diligence to figure out what's going on. Ticketing systems are not sufficient. Most organizations rely on their ticketing system to do this. They are not sufficient. You'll figure that out with your first major incident. Two things that are important here for capabilities in the case management system. The first is timelines and the ability to visualize them and continue to inform them. The second is swim lanes. As you begin to see different systems, different pieces of software, different users, different threat actors, you want to be able to separate this all into swim lanes. It will help you tell the story when you need to. Also, with records management, we have to have the ability to preserve this evidence. We can't simply store it on a disk drive, whether your environment is offline or not. We need to be able to vault these capabilities. Many people today simply, catch it on an air-gapped system and they maintain it there. You will find that will be challenged in court. That will be scrutinized. Your chain of custody is fundamentally important to being able to build a defendable case against your attacker. Admissibility is not something you get to decide. That will be decided in a courtroom and not by people who are technologists. Follow the procedures. There are 5 laws. I won't get into that today. The last piece we're going to get into here as I begin to wrap is enterprise reporting. This is where it all gets into the C team, who doesn't want to hear any of this, or the boardroom, where I'm spending more and more of my time lately. How do we bring awareness to them? This is not the visualization we brought to analysts. This is the story we tell in the boardroom. Folks today talk about, I need metrics. I got to show compliance. I want to bring fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Let's show a threat landscape. I don't approach it that way at all. I say, let's focus on the risk to the business. Let's talk about the top 5, 6 risks to your business, and let's talk about them as scenarios. Make it scenario driven. Tell the story that says there are threat actors that are ransoming people in our vector. We know that. No fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's simply a fact. We have vulnerabilities. Our users have admin access on their workstations. The consequences are significant. This is a risk scenario. Now let's talk about the controls either in place or what we feel would help burn down that risk. But it's a story about impact to the business. It is not a story about payloads and vectors and APTs. That's not what people want to hear about at the C team or in the boardroom. We have to establish that storytelling capability. And it should always be in terms of consequences. Compliance is important. We all need to report compliance out. That is a fundamental aspect of this reporting. but it is not security. It is a minimum threshold that shows we are, in fact, having the due diligence in place to understand what our exposure is, and we are applying some level of due care that is commensurate with a reasonable person standard. But it needs to be relevant. It's not just enough to go against a standard. I'm a big proponent of things like the ISO standards and NIST, but that is not sufficient to truly defend the business. In terms of your reporting capabilities, you want to be able to speak business and tell the story to the leadership in terms of these risk scenarios. I have something I call risk level agreements, which is what we put in place with these risk scenarios. But every one of these risk scenarios, by the way, is very similar to those of us in the boardroom, because we have risk scenarios for things like what happens with financial risk, what happens with our IP risk. This is the language of the board. You need to adapt to that rather than ask them to adapt to you. The life cycle in general, I'm not going to go through this. We've talked about this already, but I use this graphic often to talk about how we mature security operations with a whole host of controls, but most importantly is the intelligence based on the knowledge base here in the center of mission, network, and threat. We've got to have that context in order to inform all of our activities in the security ops center. I won't bore you with this particular build-out slide. This talks about the generations that I've observed over the course of time. That's a whole session in itself. Let me wrap here now and say, first and foremost, thank you for the 45 minutes of attention today, but more importantly, thank you for the commitment you're making and demonstrating here to build a better tomorrow and to create better security operations in terms of defending our businesses, our organizations, our users, and driving down risk. It is all about risk. Don't count the number of tools in your environment without fully understanding what you need to do in terms of those security operations capabilities. Again, I thank you. I apologize for running over. We will be posting the video of this online. If you need to follow up with me, you can find me at SOC Taxonomy. That is published in the open space. All the content we've here has been handed out to industry many times to help you build your plan. Again, thank you. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of the conference.